If we open our city doors to the robotaxi, or even worse, the privately owned automated car, in the same way as we opened our city doors to the conventional car a couple of decades ago, then we're not going to solve any problem.
Hello everyone, welcome to Everything is Changing. My name is Ahmetcan Uzlaşık. I'm a climate journalist working for Revolve Media, a media group communicating sustainability through its quarterly magazine. And we are recording this interview ahead of our mobility issue, Revolve Magazine issue 61.
Hi everyone, I'm Karen Vancluysen. I'm the Secretary General of POLIS, which is the European network of cities and regions working together on sustainable mobility and innovation.
So Karen, I would like to start with this word competitiveness. You have an upcoming paper arguing and challenging this word competitiveness, which kind of became a buzzword in the EU policy. EU has made competitiveness one of its central priorities, as we know. Yet your upcoming paper argues that the original meaning of the word compéter is actually to strive together. Has Europe framed this debate too narrowly, you think? And what does a competitive city actually look like in 2026?
Well, there are a couple of messages that we want to convey with our upcoming paper. Indeed, as you say, it's the buzzword today. It's all about competitiveness. In the previous legislative period, we were talking about climate, we were talking about the Green Deal. Today, we're talking about competitiveness and we're talking about an industry deal. But actually, our statement is that it's not one or the other, and they should go hand in hand and they should go together. If we want to be competitive, we also have to keep looking at the climate. And we should stop thinking that ecology and economy cannot go together, or are enemies or are competitors for that matter, not in the original meaning, but in the way it's interpreted today, because that represents short-term thinking. We should indeed go back to the original sense of the word, which means that they should be aligned and they should go hand in hand. Because given the current climate challenges that we are facing, we need long-term visions. And if you would think that climate and competitiveness don't go together, that would be short-term thinking. If we don't invest now in climate mitigation and climate adaptation, the bill in the future will be so much bigger that we will have to pay. I mean, think about a heat wave. We're sweating right now, right? So we see today already in a very tangible way what climate change means, but also look at the bigger geopolitical context that we're in, and oil dependence. We really need to move away from that and think about alternatives. So it is clear with all the negative externalities that we are facing that we need a new paradigm shift in the transport sector and a transition. At the same time, we also have to make sure that that is going to be an inclusive transition, that we don't leave anyone behind. So you have the climate issue. That's where cohesion comes in. We can't leave anyone behind, and we have to look at this in an inclusive way. And then finally, innovation will help us to deal with the challenges. So that's also where competitiveness and the private sector comes in. So basically, what we need to do is align these three: climate, competitiveness, and cohesion. And then we're good to go, and then we're on the right track.
I will ask about all of these, but let's move on to the economic side right now. I feel like mobility is very rarely discussed as an economic issue, but merely as a transport issue. To give some numbers from your own paper, transport produces around 1/4 of the EU's greenhouse gas emissions, while congestion alone costs Europe an estimated 180 billion every year, more than 1% of EU GDP. Do you think policymakers today underestimate mobility's role in the economy?
For sure. I mean, because mobility serves a purpose. It gives us all access to essential services. It allows us to participate in society, to get to places and to access jobs, for example. So it is really a cornerstone of the economy. At the same time, you mentioned the cost of unsustainable transport to society, which is also an issue, whether we talk about congestion or greenhouse gas emissions, or not mentioned yet, but also instrumental and a crucial challenge in that respect is air quality. We need to improve our air quality, and transport is also a major contributor to air pollution. And this also comes with a huge cost in terms of health, the health of our citizens, but also there's potential if you look at the sustainable equivalent. Active travel, for example, comes with huge health benefits, and that's also something we can quantify in economic terms. If people are more active, if they have more physical activity, we will have healthier people. And that's why you see, for example, that today people from the health insurance sector start to look at how to improve air quality, because ultimately that will reduce costs for them in the longer run when it comes to the health impacts of air pollution. So it is all linked, and it's all coming together. And what we still see today is that we do not sufficiently internalize these negative externalities. We still indirectly subsidize polluting traffic, or we don't factor in the economic cost of congestion. So there's a lot of hidden costs out there impacting the economy. So on the one hand, transport is crucial for the economy in terms of access to services, I said. On the other hand, we finally need to internalize the external costs of unsustainable transport to society.
As you said, there are many intertwined dimensions of this topic. So before moving forward with the joint charter that you released with Eurostis, I would want to ask the EU's industrial policy, because one argument that stood out in your paper is that cities are no longer simply implementing European policy, they are becoming market shapers. And you gave a couple of examples, whether it's Madrid's transition away from diesel buses or Leuven's autonomous shuttle pilots. We see that cities increasingly seem to be deciding which technologies succeed. Is industrial policy gradually moving away from Brussels to, let's say, city halls?
We need both. I mean, for Europe to reach its ambitions and targets, for sure they will need cities and regions. They hold the keys to many of the ambitions that Europe has, whether we're talking about competitiveness or whether we're talking about climate goals or safety goals or health goals. So we need each other, let's say. Second, indeed, when we talk about competitiveness, and that's also a key message of our paper, we feel that the instrumental role of cities and regions as major clients to the industry is not sufficiently recognized. Normally, you would think it's a given that the industry listens to its major clients. But still, within the whole competitive discussion, it's not a given right now that cities and regions have a seat at the table. A lot is being said above their heads, or they're being talked about, but not talked with. And that is really an essential problem, because if then you look at the reality on the ground, indeed, they are infrastructure managers, they are mobility service providers, they are procurers of innovation and of products. So basically, they really have a big impact and can really steer the market in a certain direction. So I think it would only be normal to listen to their needs and to what they want. And that's not sufficiently done right now in the industry context and in the competitiveness discussion. So what we really do as POLIS as well is, while our membership is inherently public sector, cities and regions, we invest a lot of time in facilitating that dialogue with the industry and making the voice of cities and regions heard as shapers of innovation. So this is really important in moving forward. We need some deal of disruption. So sometimes as an innovation comes our way and we really didn't see it coming, and it might help us in the long run. But ultimately what we want is policy responsive innovation coming from the private sector that helps us as public sector to reach our policy goals. So a smart city is not a city that jumps on any and every technology coming our way, but chooses those technologies and products that help them reach their policy goals. And that's also a way to shape the market, and that's why the market should also listen to what cities and regions are looking for and not looking for.
There's another very important topic that is becoming more and more widespread and important, I would say, automation.
Yeah.
Before moving on with the charter, I would like to ask, does automation mean anything alone when talking about sustainability? Because I don't think many people easily link automation with decarbonization or sustainability. What would you say?
It is indeed important to ask ourselves the question first, what problem are we trying to solve? And what solution is the most suitable to address that problem? And is automation the first solution we think of? Or is it the second or the 10th? Or maybe not a solution at all to the particular challenges we want to address? after a couple of years of silence and maybe disappointment, now the hype around automation is really back. And I think it's an excellent example also of what I was mentioning earlier, that we need innovation to help us reach our policy goals. First, if you look at the bigger European picture, the vibe right now is, oh, we are too late. Others have come before us, China, the US, when it comes to automation. Europe missed the boat, or the automated car. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but what I do think is that we can make a difference by looking at automation in a way that indeed it should be linked to what we are trying to achieve in terms of sustainability and in terms of safety in our cities and regions, so that we put public value front and center in the conversation around automation.
Okay, I was going to ask that, like, for example, robotaxis.
Yeah.
Does Europe have a different direction or a path compared to US and China? Because private robotaxis are becoming more and more popular in these other countries. What about the EU?
If Europe has a different take on it, that remains to be seen. But for sure, cities and regions in Europe have a different take on it. They want to prioritize automation in relation to public transport. So automated shuttles that can feed major public transport services, or even automated buses that can address workforce challenges, for example. If we open our city doors to the robotaxi, or even worse, the privately owned automated car, in the same way as we opened our city doors to the conventional car a couple of decades ago, then we're not going to solve any problem. On the contrary, we might be flooded with even more cars, because people will perceive travel time differently, as they can do something else while traveling. So we might have more kilometers driven, we might have more urban sprawl, we might have cities full of automated pods where no one is walking and cycling anymore. And that's not the kind of vision that we have for the future of our cities. So really what is important today is to set the rules of the game for what will be arriving tomorrow. And cities and regions have the power to regulate in or out a certain service on their territories. So that's why it's so important to have that dialogue with the industry, and for the industry to listen to what it is that cities and regions are looking for or not looking for in view of these sustainability and safety objectives that you mentioned. So if we prioritize just robotaxis, I don't think we are going to meet the targets that we have. If we prioritize public transport use cases, then I think we're getting somewhere, and we really can make a difference also in terms of urban versus rural, for example. Yeah. It's much less efficient to deploy mass transit in low density areas. So we need alternative solutions that are better suited to those needs, but also specific needs of mobility impaired people. That's also where automation can really help and can make a difference in terms of making our transport system more inclusive. So I do see a lot of potential. I do see a lot of good use cases, but it can also go into the wrong direction if we don't think carefully and don't learn from maybe the mistakes that have been made elsewhere in China, in the US, and do better. Yeah. I think we really have an opportunity to maybe be slower, but be better.
Yeah, just for the sake of the argument, to give an example, could cities have the power to say no to robotaxis, for example, depending on their own circumstances and situation? Indirectly quoting from your own charter, it argues that cities should be able to regulate automated vehicles through pricing, geofencing, occupancy requirements, and access restrictions if necessary. Some technology companies would argue that this slows innovation, for example. Where should Europe draw the line between encouraging innovation and protecting public space from this, like, for example, robotaxi debate that we just mentioned?
So for any innovation that we are talking about and that is coming our way, there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to be next. We don't know what's going to stay. But what we do know is that the majority of those innovations are being rolled out on city streets, and that's no different for automation. So, and when I talk about the governance of innovation and what I was mentioning earlier, it's always about striking the right balance between allowing innovation to thrive and making that innovation policy responsive. And that's what we will have to do now as well. And indeed, cities are more powerful than you think because they are in charge of urban space, which means that they can decide which modes they prioritize by giving more space to a certain transport mode or taking away space from another transport mode. They can also introduce urban vehicle access regulations, whether it's congestion charges or whether it's low or zero emission zones that tackle air quality and CO2 challenges. So they do have quite a lot of power. Having said that, not always the right competence is with the right level. What we've seen in the US is that cities' hands were tied because when it came to regulating robotaxis, the competence was with the state level. And that's how you ended up in situations where cities like San Francisco were faced with chaos in their city streets, but could not always intervene in the way they had to intervene to tackle the challenges they were facing. So cities have a lot of power, but it will also be important for the different levels of government to be aligned so that we can really decide where it makes sense and where it does not make sense. And that requires Europe, the national level, and the local level to be more aligned. And unfortunately, in a broader context, what we see happening increasingly is a misalignment between the local and the national level. Whereas in an ideal world, the national level should empower cities and regions because we all need each other to deliver on the targets. So I think this is a very interesting challenge that we have in front of us to do it right. But as I said, it could go either way.
And it's a unique challenge to the EU because EU has a different structure. It's a supranational organization. And there's, as you said, the EU level, nation level, and the local level. I want to move on because you mentioned it earlier, the geopolitical context and the dependency on oil, now dependency on critical minerals, and which, as we know, China dominates the sector with the EVs and with the automation right now. I sometimes feel like the EU has multiple chessboards in front of their representatives. One chessboard you play for sustainability, and one chessboard you play in the geopolitical context and try to reduce your dependency. Now, your charter recognizes that European cities may initially need to deploy non-European automated mobility technologies while building their own ecosystem. I think this is a very important discussion to have. How realistic is to achieve mobility sovereignty without closing the door to global innovation?
Yeah, it is an interesting discussion indeed. And to make it very concrete, so Leuven's autonomous shuttle feeding public transport that is currently running as a pilot right now is with Chinese technology. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the market, the number of manufacturers coming with solutions for the public transport use case is very limited. So that comes back to my previous point. If you want customers, if you want a market, listen to those customers and co-shape innovation together and tailor your products to what the market is looking for, in this case, cities and regions. Cities want to buy European, they really do. Yeah. But if they cannot find what they are looking for at a reasonable price, within a reasonable timeline, and with the volumes that they need, and of high quality, of course, then they might be forced to look elsewhere. And this is something that we see happening, for example, when we talk about electric buses. So we're not even talking about automation yet. The message we keep getting from our cities and regions is that they don't find, with these criteria that I just mentioned, what they need for electric buses on the European market, and that they are forced to go elsewhere. So I think that's another example of making sure that we have that conversation and that we move forward together in terms of safeguarding Europe's competitiveness, because cities want to buy European, but then please also talk to them, listen to them, work with them, and provide what they are looking for.
Yeah. Karen, as we know, everything changes so fastly. And as the name of this podcast, everything is changing in general. But if we meet again in 5 years, which feels like a long time as things change so fastly, as I said, what would convince you that Europe has genuinely transformed urban mobility? Is it fewer cars, cleaner air, autonomous buses, stronger public transport, or something less obvious?
It's all of the above, but also a couple of things that are going to be game changers or critical factors in my view. What we want is cities for people. Let's be clear about that. Not cities for cars, even if they are electric or automated. We still want to safeguard quality of life. We want cities where it's nice to live, for people, for children to play, to move around. This is really at the core of our vision. For that to happen, I think the number one game changer is not going to be one or the other gadget or technology, but is the massive reallocation of space in favor of sustainable transport modes. We have so unfairly allocated space in our cities to just almost entirely go to the private car. And we are coming out of decades of car-centric planning, and we need to do something about it. Give more space to pedestrians, give more space to cyclists, but also this broadening group of light mobility modes, because it's not just bikes anymore. It's e-scooters, it's electric bikes, it's speed pedelecs, it's fat bikes, it's cargo bikes. You know, we need more space. They can't just all go on that small, tiny bike lane, if there is a bike lane to begin with. So this reallocation of space is going to be a game changer. Then we also need to tackle transport poverty, the urban-rural divide. Look at solutions, including automation, that they can also overcome forced car ownership and car dependence in lower density areas. And then what is really ultimately instrumental as well in moving forward, and that's also why we published this competitiveness paper, is the next multi-annual financial framework. If competitiveness is all going to be about industry and not about how the private sector enables competitiveness, if transport is only going to be about automotive and not about the wider integrated road transport system that we have been working on for so many years, then we're heading for a very bad future, I think. And finally, if we only have cities depend on the goodwill of the national level to make sure that European funds are coming their way, then also this is going to be a risk. We will lose European added value, and we will lose the direct link between cities and Europe. And we've always seen Europe as an important ally at a local level to move forward. So when we have these discussions and as we move forward in the current negotiations around the next MFF, please have cities and regions also as eligible partners for European funding. And don't just look at the industry, don't just look at automotive when we talk about transport, and don't leave all the decisions to the national level when it comes to deciding where the money is going. We need to be eligible also for the Framework Program for Research and Innovation, FP10, and we need also to be part of the European Competitiveness Fund. Otherwise, Europe will not be competitive. And one final point in terms of long-term vision that will help us to move forward in a smart way is the instrumental tool of the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, which Europe is also promoting and that we also really support. It helps cities to develop long-term visions for mobility. It helps them to smartly integrate innovation to serve policy goals. It helps them to integrate different packages of measures to systematically involve citizens along the way and stakeholders from the private sector, and really also to link up with other policy domains, because transport needs to talk to climate, to energy, to health, to economy. We all need to bring to housing, all need to bring these different policy domains together. And the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, which will become obligatory for over 400 urban nodes across the Trans-European Transport Network, is going to help to make that happen.
What you said is very important, and I think you really, in a good way, summarize POLIS's position on these matters. Now, my final question, and it's going to be a critical one. I'm an ordinary citizen, and I know that many Europeans feel mobility is actually getting worse in some dimensions. For example, public transport strikes, congestion, housing moving further away from jobs, expensive EVs, and now AI and automation promising another revolution, which is very confusing. Why should ordinary citizens like me believe this transition will improve their daily lives rather than simply create another layer of complexity?
I think what we experience right now when it comes to transport policy is a challenge that is much bigger than just transport, and that is the context of increasing populism and polarization, which is also part of this bigger geopolitical climate that we are currently in. That means that it's no joy to hold a mobility portfolio. So within POLIS, we also have a political group where the deputy mayors in charge of mobility come together. And I can tell you it has turned into a therapeutic group, because it is not easy to show leadership, to keep your eyes on the target and not be distracted by what we would call is a very loud minority within cities who are pretty much against everything, whether it's transport-related policies or whether it's losing in the football championship, or whether it's COVID-19 measures. You know, they use whatever opportunity to go out on the street and destroy. There is a much bigger majority, actually, that agrees with measures that are being taken in favor of sustainable mobility. And sustainability is about economy, it's about the environment, and it's about social dimensions. So sustainable mobility is inherently inclusive. And when people don't feel left behind, they will also more easily agree with the measures that are being taken. So that means that also from day zero, basically, when you start shaping your policies, you need to co-create, you need to talk to your citizens, explain why you are doing what you are doing, and how this will be important for the greater good, because political leadership requires always finding the right balance between what the individual citizen wants and what the city as a whole needs, the greater good versus my personal interests, you know, and those are not necessarily, or at least not automatically aligned. Let the other idiots take the bus so that I can drive my car more quickly, you know, not in my backyard, all these different symptoms. So that's also where political leadership comes in. But talk to your citizens, listen to what they have to say, incorporate that into your policies, and that will already make a great deal of difference. But also, we have to accept that we can't just bring the carrots out. We will have to bring out the sticks as well, and come with measures that maybe are not necessarily popular, but are very impactful and really necessary to address the negative externalities that we have been talking about. And in that sense, maybe let me quote a former transport minister here in Brussels, who said, sometimes you have to make people happy against their own will. You know, people are resistant to change, but once you have pedestrianized an area and you can sit on terraces and you can play there and you can meet each other, very rarely will people want to go back to the way it was when it was maybe a big parking lot, or it was a big street full of car lanes. So we also sometimes have to push through a little bit to then see that people like it. But what is very powerful to win the hearts and minds of people is also to pilot, to trial new solutions, let people experience what change feels like, and then they will be more convinced. And in that sense, the whole COVID-19 street experiment was a silver lining, was positive, because people could feel what it is like to have a city with fewer cars, where more people are walking and cycling. And it really helped smart cities to accelerate the transition towards cities for people rather than cities for cars.
Thank you, Karen. Vancluysen. Thank you for joining Everything is Changing.